Welcome to Life on Pause, a podcast defining the experience of being a young adult with cancer.
Hello, and welcome to Life on Pause. My name is Jill Robertson, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Thanks for joining us, and make sure that you like, subscribe, or follow us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I am the Four Diamonds Program Coordinator at Penn State Health Pediatric Oncology. I'm here with Joe Apgar as a follow-up discussion to our webinar held on April 25th, titled Cancer and Blood Disorders, When Disease Treatment Pushes Fertility and Family Planning to the Forefront in Adolescents and Young Adults. Joe Apgar is a 38-year-old Penn State graduate who was treated at Penn State Health when he was diagnosed with stage 2 non-seminoma testicular cancer at age 21. He's now CEO of Pelotonia, a nonprofit community that's passionate about ending cancer. You can find more information about the great things they're doing at pelotonia.org. Joe is married and has a 5-year-old daughter. Thank you for joining me today, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
First, I just want to say thank you for joining us in April for our discussion. I think that we were given great insight from our patient panelists, and you were very candid with your discussions and your experiences, so I really appreciate that. We didn't get to dive into some of the other topics that are relevant to your story, so that's why we wanted to bring you back today. Some of the things I think that you wanted to share are centered around the adoption process. But before I ask about that, I was wondering if you would tell us how you decided that you wanted to become a father.
Yeah. I think I always, thought I wanted to be a dad. I had great parents growing up, and my parents are still happily married. I think they passed 40 years married last year, their 40th anniversary. So I just grew up in a great sort of household and great relationship with both my parents, and always admired my dad, and always saw myself, in those shoes at some point, and wanting to have a family. I never thought about how many children I would want in my family. But I always knew I wanted sort of that to be part of my life.
Would you share some of the things that you and your wife took into consideration when you were talking about how you would create your family?
Yeah. So, through my cancer diagnosis and sort of treatment process, I sort of tested my sperm count many, many times. And, all of the results had always come back, either too few to count, or, less than 10, active sperm, or, there were times that I had completely, what they sort of deemed deformed, or, not healthy sperm. And so we just kind of knew biologically it wasn't going to happen between us. But there were, you start to dive into the internet a little bit, and, there's lots of good information and lots of probably unhelpful information on the internet about things, but sort of realize that there are ways that people do still have biological children, even after a diagnosis like that. And so one of the things was that we learned about on the internet and then pursued, at least discussion wise, with a doctor, was something called sperm harvesting. This is where they'd actually sort of, make an incision and sort of go into your body and try to collect healthy sperm. We pretty quickly decided that was not the route we wanted to go, given that I had lost sort of a testicle through cancer. It just didn't seem like that was a long-term good decision. Like, thinking about the risks of surgery and all of that. And so we sort of had quickly decided no. But prior to that, we had always, or even early in my wife and I's relationship, had always talked about adoption. Being pregnant for her was never something she had dreamed of. So she had always thought about being a mother, but never actually thought about being pregnant. And I don't know if that was more of like, I don't want to be pregnant, or she just sort of never envisioned sort of the pregnancy part, where some people do, so that's sort of an exciting thing for people. And so adoption had always been sort of our first choice. But we talked to a lot of people about sort of the different ways and kind of quickly landed on adoption. My dad was adopted, as was my aunt. So my paternal grandparents, my grandmother struggled with fertility. She had had cancer herself. And so they adopted their two children from different sort of different birth parents. But so I always grew up and I knew my dad was adopted. It was something he talked about. And so it never, it was never a thing. It's just like, oh, that's just how my grandparents made a family. And so we always approached it in such a positive light. And that was just like the option we knew we were going to pursue.
A couple of thoughts on what you said. I'm glad you brought up the procedure to sort of, I'm not sure exactly what the medical term is, but that you can have kind of like a more invasive procedure to try to extract sperm. Because we had a follow-up discussion with Dr. Estes, and she brought up that sometimes that is a possibility. And I know we didn't get to touch on that in April. And then also, like, I think what you're saying about having your immediate family have that experience with adoption, and that's what you grew up knowing, probably just made it so much easier for you to be open to that idea.
Yeah, I think so. And it had been a good experience for my dad. And, then once we started doing our research and education, we're opened up to, it is not a simple and, straightforward world either. The world of adoption, there's not one way to do it. And so, we spent a lot of time getting educated on that.
Yeah, so probably when your father and aunt were adopted, the process was different than it is today. Um, can you tell us kind of what was the process like, and what were the things that were difficult about it, or
Yeah.
went well?
Yeah. So, sort of tell you that the journey we went on for adoption. So my dad and my aunt were both adopted from in the 50s from a New York City agency, and all adoptions were closed back then, and so records sealed, and obviously back then it was all paper records, um, and and so there's just no opportunity for my dad to know who his birth parents were. He loosely knew that they were, that the birth mother was young, she was still in high school, and that they were both athletic. That's like all he knew about them. And he also never really cared to know much about them. He's always thought his parents were the people that raised him, and I always sort of loved and respected that. So we went into the adoption process initially thinking we wanted a closed adoption, that just seemed simpler. And we also were kind of interested in international adoption because, I think you in some ways hear about that more. So what we decided to do actually was, we started talking to people. And so I've got a pretty big professional network and was able to just share with some people in confidence that we were thinking about adoption, and ended up talking to a couple people who knew someone who had adopted, relatively recently. And we actually I think we ended up inviting 4 different couples out to dinner, these sort of blind couple dates. And, and they knew what we wanted to talk about. What we learned through it was people that had been through that experience of adoption are generally very happy to share their experience and ups and downs and things to think about. And so I remember we had this one couple over for dinner, and the wife said, we have an open adoption, and we didn't start pursuing that initially, but our minds were really changed. And we ended up going through this course at Nationwide Children's Hospital, which is based here in Columbus. that does an adoption education course. It's 8 weeks long. It's like 3 hours every Monday night for 8 weeks in the fall and in the spring. And so we decided to sign up for that. And basically it takes you through every type of adoption, all of the financial options you have, the things you need to think about from a pediatrician and medical standpoint, questions you need to ask, things you need to watch out for, how to fill out the forms, how to read the forms, all this stuff. So we were totally sold on doing this course, but she also, this woman said something to me that I'll never forget, which is, she said, there's nothing better than having another adult in the world love your child. And that like stuck with us because it just felt like, she's right. So we took this course. We went into the course. We're still like, I think we want to do an international closed adoption. It would be kind of an exciting process. And it got really interesting because some countries we couldn't adopt from, a lot of countries, because I had cancer. Like they would look at my health history and say like, oh, you're not fit to adopt from our country. And we knew we had decided we wanted to adopt an infant or as close to a newborn as we possibly could. And so that ruled out, doesn't completely rule out foster care to adoption, but in most instances it does. Foster care, it's not as easy to have a newborn placed with you. International adoption is kind of similar. It's actually really tricky and difficult to adopt a newborn. You're often waiting a long time for that to happen. So we sort of pivoted to, what are our options domestically? And we started exploring and meeting with adoption agencies in town. So there happened to be, I think, 3 or 4 adoption agencies in the Central Ohio area, and we met with all of them. And they're all different. Some are very faith-based. Some are, more what I would say, like service-based in the way that they like work really closely with state agencies, and sort of that's like their pipeline. And then we met with an agency and a woman who was actually very focused on the LGBTQ and same-sex couple adoption space. That was a really underserved space for a long time, become more and more popular, really since the, I think, passing of gay marriage laws. And it was really interesting because same-sex couples, often their first choice for creating a family is adoption. And hetero couples, adoption's often not their first choice. A lot of people come to the adoption process after infertility, after, maybe failed IVF or miscarriages and things like that. And because we had been set on adoption for so long, felt like we had the mindset of almost a same-sex couple. We were like so excited to be pursuing adoption, and that was our first choice. And the adoption network was actually called Choice Network, and sort of centered around like, this is your first choice. And so we ended up pursuing our adoption with this agency, and we wanted it to be an open adoption. We decided, so we had sort of completely changed our mind from a closed international adoption to a open domestic adoption. And what we decided was we wanted to have as much of a relationship with the birth mother or birth parents as we could, partially because we wanted that open pathway and communication network for our child later in life. They have questions, but second, because we wanted to have, a great pipeline of medical history information. And so you can try to get good medical history information sort of at time of birth, but things change over time, right? And so families, develop things like dementia or diabetes or, these other sort of diseases that can present later in life. Would we want to know about that? And so that's what led us to sort of really thinking about the open adoption process. And so we started our paperwork process in January of 2018. Took about 6 months to finish all the paperwork. Doesn't always take that long. We took that long because we were traveling a lot and procrastinated a little bit. But it's not a small undertaking to go through the paperwork process. And we were home study approved. So we had gotten through all of our paperwork. We had gotten, our home checked by the fire marshal. You get all your finances reviewed, and, you sit down with a counselor and they kind of assess your family and your relationship. And they then assess each parent one-on-one to make sure this is what you both want and that you're fit to be parents. And it's actually really invasive, but not in a negative way, but it's very thorough. And it's funny because, 2 18-year-olds could just have a baby if they wanted to.
I was just thinking
biologically,
the same thing.
It's like no one's checking their finances,
right?
Seeing if they're financially fit to have a child, but all of a sudden you're going through the adoption process and you are. And so, it's not inexpensive either.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. You can go through the foster system and the state system, which the process looks a lot different, and the costs are, it's not entirely cheap, but it's not overly expensive. But, you can do what we did, which is you use a private agency and, you use private lawyers, and you try to streamline and make the process as simple as you can by involving experts and professionals. And it gets expensive. It was, I think, $35,000. And people finance that they take out loans and they do all sorts of stuff and to pay for that, but it's expensive. There's, you got to come up with $35,000.
Yeah.
In our case. And you also pay, and this is different state by state, you pay expenses to the birth mother. Okay. So in Ohio, that is capped at $3,000. So that will be medical bills, things like that. But in some states, there's no limit on that. And it ultimately ends up being what the birth mother might ask for.
So it becomes like a negotiation.
She could be 4 months pregnant. She's got 5 months to go, and she needs money for rent and food and medical bills and transportation and all this stuff. And like that becomes part of the conversation. And so it gets complicated really quickly. And that's where it looks so different for every family. Yeah. Which is really interesting.
I have a very basic understanding of adoption process, domestic and international. I actually did a little bit of work as a social worker on international adoptions for China. I did some home studies, not for a very long time. So I have a basic understanding. However, I'm just wondering, my impression was that Americans would choose international adoption because it might be a little bit less expensive. The timeline might not take as long. But then, like you said, the probability of having an infant placement is lower. Is my impression of that true? Was that your experience?
I think it's probably hard to assign any hard and fast truth to anything. I mean, from a cost standpoint, maybe your costs to agencies and an orphanage or wherever the baby's being placed from are lower, but you've got to travel, you've got to take time off work, you're doing those other things. And so our education on it was that international adoption could be much more expensive sort of over time. And then the timeline thing, domestically, it could be 2 weeks, 2 years, 5 years. And I think in similar cases internationally, and the process is different. Like if you adopt an infant at birth, domestically, it's very different than being in a process maybe with China where that the baby that's going to be placed with you was born. But you're just like getting pictures and maybe some videos for the first 9 months. And so that it's like a different sort of mental stress that's being placed on your family. And so that's where it at the surface level, it seems like adoption's adoption. But when you get into it, every process looks different. Every country looks different. And there's so many needs out there. And the other complicating factor is, it's really sad, but the other complicating factor is war and how many, children end up as orphans and without families because of wars going on. And that's always happening, in different parts of the world. And the U.S. may or may not be involved, but there's always those conflicts happening, and as a result, children end up without families, and there's so many complicating factors to it. It gets really kind of emotionally taxing.
Yeah. So how long was it for you, your family, um, from when you felt like you had all your paperwork completed until you had a phone call saying, we have a match for your family and we'll be able to do this placement?
It was about 6 months, but our match actually didn't come through our adoption agency. Our match came through a doctor, OBGYN, who was a family member of a close friend. It was just, that's not uncommon to have happen. Someone joked, but I actually don't think it was a real joke. I think there's some truth to it, that that a lot of adoptions actually come from hairdressers, because they're talking to people all day, and hairdressers and churches, it's these communities of people, and it's like, oh, so-and-so's, granddaughters, got pregnant, and, they want to place the baby for adoption. Like, they're like the connectors of things.
How has your relationship with the birth mother evolved over time?
With open communication with her, and seen her from time to time, and gotten together with her for, like at a park or for ice cream and things like that. She's amazing young woman who we have just so much respect for and admiration for. And I think it'll be a really great sort of lifelong friendship. And, she'll always be someone that our family looks out for and cares for.
Do you ever see, I mean, it's hard to predict future relationships, but do you feel like it's a relationship that might just kind of flourish over time between your daughter and the birth mom, or maybe she's just decided kind of to take a backseat role? Or do you kind of lay out parameters as far as involvement, how much involvement you would like her to have? Like, how does all that work?
Yeah, I mean, that, I think at a high level, with any adoption, those are sort of things you that are discussed, and that's where the role of the social worker plays, a really, really strong role in helping navigate that. And you don't know what, as first time parents, you don't know what questions to ask, and no one knows what questions to ask. And so that's really the role of the social worker. And I think one of the great things about the course we had taken at Nationwide Children's Hospital was that they talked about those things, and they had, both adoptive parents come in and talk about those things that had children that were, young adults by then. But they also had birth parents come in and talk about, the other side of those things. And so, it's all stuff that sort of gets laid out and evolves over time. And, people's needs ebb and flow and change with the things they have going on in life. But, we're really happy with the situation we have, and there's nothing I would change about it.
That's great. So what do you think, what about being a father brings you joy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that, whenever someone says parenting's hard, they're right. It's just a different thing. You can kind of imagine what it would be like, but you really don't know until you do it. It's I think everyone, their entire life is always trying to grow and evolve as a person, and parenting's just like adding another thing into that mix. And so, we try to just make sure our daughter gets exposed to a lot of things, and we want her to have a good education, and make great friends and make good decisions. But I think, being a dad's been really fun. I certainly hold more of the play role in our house. I'm always good for for playing and sports and getting outside and doing all that stuff. And sort of the natural role I fell into, maybe because I'm not as good at some of the other stuff. But it's fun. It's having a little kid look up to you constantly is amazing, and watching them learn and fail and figure things out, and it's a lot of fun. And I think it sort of changes your priorities in a lot of ways. You go from in your you're in college and then you're in your 20s. At least for us in our early 30s, we got married when we were 27. Yeah, we were 27, and we had 5 or 6 years where we were just married. We both had jobs. We were traveling a lot and doing all that stuff, and and then life shifts into parenthood, and we're not traveling as much, but we're doing these other fun things that we want to do, and so your priorities just change, and all in a good way. There's nothing better than having getting a hug and having someone call you dad, and so it's been really fun. And both my parents are local here. They've since moved to Columbus because they wanted to be really active grandparents, and so seeing that dynamic with my the grandparent grandchild relationship is great, and it's something really fun as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to view your parents in a different light as grandparents and see how they are different, how they interact differently with your child as opposed to how they did with you growing up. And it's just wonderful to observe all these people in your tribe, your village, pour into your child, all just because they love you so much and they're going to love that child so much.
Yeah, my daughter gets away with way more as a grandchild than I did as a child. So
yes,
there's a lot more leniency that I see in my parents.
Yeah. It's a great dynamic. My parents are, and even my in-laws were very involved in helping us raise our kids when they were younger. Kind of along the same lines of parenthood, do you feel like you parent differently than other fathers that you might know kind of more closely in your circle as a result of the health experiences that you had?
I don't think so. No, I think, it sort of parents, I've got a great group of friends, a great group of dads, and they're all awesome dads. They're all super present. I think, there's generational shifts and differences in, how people parented 20 years ago and 40 years ago. And, I think parents today are really thoughtful about presence and priorities, and which is great. And, at my daughter's school, I see lots of dads on field trips and all of that stuff, which I know growing up, like that wasn't always the case. It always seemed like it was the moms or things like that. So I feel like there's been a really great shift from a father perspective. But, I recognize, I think the differences of having gone through a cancer experience myself when I was young is like, I view my entire life differently, and, want to have a lot of meaning in the things I do, and sort of legacy I can leave. And so that all gets interwoven into, how I parent, but also how I show up as a husband and, a son and a coworker and a leader. And so I think it's all kind of influenced in that way. But, we're really fortunate, family. And so I've had the opportunity to do really fun things. And, my dad said something to me years ago that he just felt like after I had gone through a cancer experience, I rarely pass up an opportunity that's in like fun or interesting. Like I'm always just, and how do we say yes to fun things? And I think I do that as a dad too. It's like, let's stay up late tonight and let's go to this baseball game, or let's go to the soccer game. And maybe not as rigid as I once was, but just more like, let's have great experiences, and um, just create a lot of memories in that way.
Yeah, if you don't focus on the fun, you kind of get drugged down by the monotony and all the pressures and the responsibilities, and you live. I'm hearing you say you live life intentionally, with intention because of what you went through, and I think that's such a gift to all the people that you love. Mhm. Going back to the cost of adoption, um, here at Penn State Health, we're fortunate to have funding through the Four Diamonds Fund. And through the Four Diamonds Fund, there are some available, there's some available coverage for like egg and semen freezing and so harvesting and freezing of eggs and sperm. Uh, However, there at this point, there is not coverage or financial assistance for adoption. And so I know from speaking with some friends who have gone through it, like depending on who your employer is, they might offer some assistance. I know that there are some community organizations that offer assistance depending on your situation. And I understand your wife is a committee member with Worth the Wait. And so if you would, want to maybe talk about what they do, that would be cool.
Yeah. So Mike and Megan Shear started Worth the Wait a few years ago, and they're a young family, just like my wife Jill and I are, and they had sort of their own challenges of ultimately having their son, and their son's a little older than our daughter, a couple of years older, but um, if you've ever had the chance to meet Mike and Megan, like they're the best. Such good-hearted people, like such awesome parents. Mike's become a really good friend. Um, Mike and I had similar sort of cancer diagnoses and sort of treatment journeys. And so, there's a sort of a space out there that wasn't being filled, which was assistance for things. And so grants for, adoption and egg retrieval and sperm freezing and all these things. And part of it's education too. And so they're providing grants to people in the family planning process, or who think they might want to have families someday who've gone through, cancer. And it's really interesting. We looked into a lot of that as we navigated our situation. And there's a lot of great organizations out there. I think Mike and Megan have done an awesome job educating and getting in front of people and getting in front of the right people. Because I actually, I think they're part of their strategies. How do they get in front of healthcare providers and people that can give you this information early? Because that wasn't happening in my own process. We were having to find that stuff on our own. And, we ultimately, we didn't pursue any of those paths, partially because resources are scarce there. And we were in a situation where we both had good jobs, and we didn't want to take from someone else who could sort of, also get it. We could sort of pay our own way there. But it's the idea of the organization and what they're doing. I absolutely love. My wife and I are supporters of the organization financially. My wife's on their committee, sort of organizing committee. So I love what they're doing. I'd love to see more organizations do things like that. I'd love to see Worth the Wait grow and just, be this amazing resource for, patients at the right moment. And I think, I've had a chance to, to sit, near my wife while she's called someone a grant recipient, and it's life-changing. And it's really powerful. And so I'm sort of the ultimate fan of Worth the Wait and what Mike and Megan are doing. And when you talk to them, you can hear their passion for this space. But there's a lot of opportunity for people to get involved in this space, because it's sort of this very lightly discussed, still kind of hush hush thing. And I think they're doing an amazing job at bringing the conversation to the surface.
As you said, there are so many organizations focused on the cancer realm in different categories and age groups. And I think I've seen so many grow, knowing where they started from and where they're at now. So I know Worth the Wait has the potential to do that. Yeah. Okay. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to share with us today?
No, I think I would just leave sort of people with the message of, there's no right or wrong way to make a family. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I think just being on the same page with your partner about, what's right for your situation and your, the time you are in your life and the different stressors you want to put on, your life and sort of what stages all of it's stressful at different parts. And, people who've gone through, IVF, obviously something we didn't go through, but we've known people that have gone through that, and that's really stressful. There's lots of ups and downs in that, and adoption's the same way. There's lots of ups and downs and so in regular biological pregnancy that sort of happens naturally, there's lots of ups and downs. And so there's no perfect way to do any of it. There's no right or wrong way to make a family. But there are lots of options to make a family. And so what I love about it is, there's options for anyone that does want to pursue having a family, and you can make that happen. And it's the ultimate gift. It's it's the ultimate responsibility, but sort of it's the end of the rainbow of often a poor health diagnosis at some point in your life, and I wouldn't change any of it. Wouldn't change a single thing that's ever happened to me. So. I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be a dad, and looking forward to, a long, long future of fathering and more memories and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, love is certainly at the center of every family, or we hope that for everyone. And really, love is all you need.
That's right.
And as someone had told me in parenting, you'll never be loved like this again. It's just the wholeheartedness of a child's love is just so pure and innocent and heartwarming.
Yeah.
So
I love that.
Joe, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate, again, your candidness and your willingness to share your story to help others and who will be listening in and maybe going through some of the same experiences that you had. I appreciate that. Listeners, please like, subscribe, or follow us on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to Life on Pause.
Ideas or suggestions for future episodes? Feel free to share them with us.
Join us for the next recording on the third Tuesday of the month.
Until next time.